This is Get Your Spirit in Shape, the podcast by United Methodist Communications and UMC.org to help us keep our souls as healthy as our bodies. I'm Joey Avino. In this Meet a Bishop episode, we're chatting with the new president of the Council of Bishops, Kenneth Carter, who serves the Florida Annual Conference. In our conversation, he talks about his faith background, his love of the outdoors and of baseball, his early days in the church, and what it's like to be president of the Council of Bishops at this time in our denomination. Meet Bishop Ken Carter. Bishop Carter, welcome to Get Your Spirit in Shape.
Thank you.
It's really a privilege to get to talk to you today and as we get to meet all of our bishops. When was your first experience with church?
You know, my first experience in church in my memory is sitting in church with my mother and my grandfather at a small church in which we grew up. It was a Baptist church, and my grandfather was actually a Quaker, and his father, my great-grandfather, was a Congregationalist. So, but the community we lived in, it was the nearest church, and I just remember being around family. And then my next memories are, and my parents are wonderful people. They experienced a divorce, and then we were not in church for a while. And then one of my mother's friends invited us to their United Methodist Church, and I was by now maybe in junior high school. And so that was my introduction to the United Methodist Church. It was, again, just not a large church, but a warm and loving church that kind of made space for this new family. And I appreciate the invitation of my mother was a school teacher, and so one of her teacher friends invited us. Yeah.
Did you take to it right away? Like, did you get involved in Sunday school or youth group or any of those things?
You know, I can remember being in youth group and then kind of youth choir and going on a youth mission trip. It was sporadic. I also played sports during that time, and of course, with in a blended family, our patterns were differed from time to time, but it was kind of an anchor, you know, I would say, and began to meet some friends in that church. Those were some of the experiences that were important to me. In college, that really began to go deeper. I was asked to be the youth minister of an inner city United Methodist Church in a kind of a medium-sized Deep South U.S. town, Columbus, Georgia, and agreed to do that. I had no formal training for that, but worked with about 18 to 20 youth. This group became kind of the center of their social life, and I met with them 3 times a week and grew to love them. They were not the children or grandchildren of the mostly retired people in that church, and so those really were the experiences where I began to grow deeper. I also did some work in the western North Carolina mountains, leading groups on hikes for kind of a week at a time. Those were really formative experiences.
Yeah. And all of this was happening. So I should have asked, where did you grow up? Where were
I
you
grew
at
up
this
in
time?
Columbus, Georgia, and so all of this was happening. The church that we became a part of was Epworth United Methodist Church, and the church where I was a youth minister was East Highland United Methodist Church, and really it was in those experiences that I came to really find that work rewarding, especially the work with those youth. My spiritual life was just sort of making it up as I went along, but just grateful that they gave me that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And by then, I realized this was sort of the church I wanted to be a part of, and I began to also explore that. My family really had a pretty ecumenical background. My great-grandfather, whom I knew very well, had worked in race relations in the South with the Congregational Christian Church, and then my grandfather had been actually a conscientious objector during World War II, and so their faith was very important to them, and I realized I needed to sort of figure that out for myself, and this seemed to be my path. Yeah.
And that was when you started to kind of make your faith your own, was in those years? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
I think it was, and I think it was just some experiences of being asked to kind of be a leader again I'm assuming that the church was simply trying to find a person to work with these young people, so it was sort of having some sort of very basic experiences of leadership, and then in light of that, reading the Bible in preparation for that. And I remember one spring I read the New Testament sort of from beginning to end, and that had a pretty profound influence on me. Again, I think coming through some family experiences where there was a lot of change, the church kind of became a kind of a home and an anchor and a way to serve. And I would say as I was sort of in college, I was investing more and more time in that kind of pursuit and wondering how this related to what I was studying, and all that was sort of, I guess, the background for attending seminary.
Yes, so tell me about that. What was your call to ministry like? When did you first start feeling like God was calling you into ordained ministry?
I think it was a couple of experiences. One was in that church, and again, I was that inner city church youth ministry. I was their Sunday morning teacher. We met Sunday evening. We met Friday evening, and I'd been with them for a couple of years, and we realized that none of them had ever been baptized. None of them had ever joined the church, and they kind of wanted to. That was something they wanted to do, and so I went to the pastor and said, this is. I feel like this is something I need. Your help with. You're going to need to help us with this. And so Sunday or two later, they all kind of walked down the aisle of that small church. They all were baptized. They all became a part of that church, and so that kind of experience was really exciting to me, and I realized that was on a minimalist level, at a very local level, what our denomination kind of experiences. That church had about 20 people who were teenagers, and about 80 people who were over 70 years of age, and no one in between. And they had missed a couple of generations, and I realized that's sort of where a lot of the churches I visit find themselves, wonderful retired persons who love their churches, who sacrificed for them, and then maybe some kind of at-risk children or youth who sometimes are near the church or sometimes in the church, and then we've often missed those groups. So that was important. And I would also say the leading, the being in the mountains was, to me, sort of the hiking, leading backpacking groups. I think just feeling close to God and creation, and those things combined just set me off on a kind of in a questioning model of, how would you do this kind of work? And it was not an audible voice, but it was definitely, this is a path. And I remember having a conversation with one of my professors. I was studying biology at the time, and he wanted me to be a part of a kind of a field research project one summer, of which they'd gotten a grant for, and to do research on streams. And I just kind of said, I have this opportunity to do this work again in the mountains this summer, and I realized this feels like a turning point. And so that was really when I began to think about how I would shift my focus from what I had been thinking I was doing to how do you prepare, and I think the idea of going to seminary was simply how could I be better prepared to do this work.
I get the sense that your love of nature kind of led you in both of those directions, right? On the one hand was the biology and understanding those things, and the other was the spiritual. And it came down to that choice at some point. That's really interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned as a child that you were kind of into sports. What sports did you play? Was there one in particular?
Well, I'm tall. I'm almost 6'7", so I always loved baseball and basketball.
Yeah.
I played a lot of football, and I did not love football. And in fact, I've often one of the memorable experiences of my life was telling my father one year I was not going to play any more football, and we had a very interesting discussion about that. And
oh, wow.
he of course finally was okay with it, but realized I was doing this to try to please him. Mm-hmm. But I loved baseball and I loved basketball, and one of my experiences of playing basketball was I grew up in an era, again in the Deep South, when the schools were being integrated, and my ninth grade year of high school was actually the year in our city that the schools were fully integrated. I think it was 1971, maybe.
Wow, yeah.
And again, this was fully, 10, 15 years before schools were integrated in some other parts of the United States. And so I can remember being one or two Anglo players
right.
on our basketball team, and it was an experience of relationships with African Americans, and so I just enjoyed that and basketball, and then enjoyed baseball as well, and probably today I enjoy. I'm a big baseball fan. Florida has spring training baseball, and which is really wonderful. And so one of the things I enjoy about baseball today is just simply the game has a fairly slow pace, and you can really talk to people. Mm-hmm. You can sit with someone, you can talk between pitches, between innings, and so that was a very fun part of growing up.
Yeah. Growing up in Georgia, are you a Braves fan? Is it safe to assume
I'm a
that?
Braves fan. Although I've come to just enjoy baseball in general, mm-hmm. But certainly did grow up as a Braves fan and enjoy them. Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in the New Jersey, so I'm a Mets fan. So we don't always get along, but that's good.
That's right. Yeah, and I think of course these teams are trading a lot of their good players. Some of them are rebuilding, so you go through real dry spells.
Yeah.
But I've been to about a third of the major league parks.
Oh wow.
The Red Sox, the Yankees, the Nationals, the Dodgers, the Cubs. And I just sort of year by year, that's one thing I try to do is to see a new baseball stadium. So that's been a lot of fun.
That's great. And I imagine you do a lot of traveling as a bishop in the church, so that might give you some opportunity to do that.
Yeah, it does. Sometimes I can just personally tack on a day at my own expense and see something like that. And it's this winter, or this summer, actually, I was asked to preach at the CalPAC conference in Southern California, and sort of tacked on a day early and saw the Dodgers with my daughter, who lives in L.A., so that was really great.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So tell me about, you're the newly elected president of the Council of Bishops. Mm-hmm. Right. What does that mean?
Well, first of all, I'll say I've served as a bishop for 6 years. I've been grateful the church called me to do this work, and I loved being a pastor, first of all, of a church. I did that for 28 years, and so never really had an aspiration to be the president of the Council of Bishops, but was, again, asked to do that. It's a group of, 65, 70 active bishops from around the world. We're on 4 continents, Africa, Europe, Philippines, Asia, and U.S. And so it's a very diverse group. And even within the United States, it's a very diverse group.
Sure.
And so I have come to know almost all of the bishops fairly well. Having been on the Commission on a Way Forward, a third of the Commission were bishops, a little less than a third. And so I came to know several of the African bishops really well, the European and the Filipino bishops, as well as some of the U.S. Bishops. And so a part of that is just getting to know them as people. And sometimes I'll just ask a bishop, and we meet twice a year for about 4 days, which is really not a lot of time for that kind of group. I realize it's very involved to get people from around the world together a couple times a year. And so I try to really ask them what's important in your context, what's important to you. And again, we just live in a very diverse contextual world. What's important in the southern part of Alabama may be very different than what's important in New England. But my role really is to try to guide and preside in the meetings. The same with it. We have an executive committee of about 18 people which also meets twice a year, and to try to work with a group of pretty high capacity people, just in service of helping the bishops' meetings to be better. But that purpose is not an end in itself. It's really to try to help the church and to try to unify and strengthen the church. And again, the work we've been doing in this particular season has been about trying to help the church to find a way forward, to be whole as a denomination, and to work on these plans, and to support the delegates who will go to the special session of the conference. What I really try to say a lot to people is, for us, it's not we really honor the leadership of lots of different constituencies in our church. So that's a part of it, and of course, my basic work is serving the Florida Conference. So it's just another layer of work. We don't have a polity where someone is president of the council and that's all they do. Some other denominations do, and I'm not advocating that we do that. but I would say it's just, if anyone listening has ever had a couple of jobs at one time, that's for a season. That's exactly what it is.
What it feels like. I imagine.
And so it involves conversations most days with one or two bishops who just have questions about things that are going on in the world. Recently, it's been about the statement the Attorney General made about separation of families, and it's been about the missionaries who were detained in the Philippines, and getting prepared for the fall. And sometimes the bishops are asked to make statements about emerging things that are going on in the world. That's actually not so different from I've been in Florida for 6 years, and we've had the Trayvon Martin death and the Pulse shootings Parkland shootings, and then when there are like natural disasters, we try to support each other. We've had that in the U.S. and Texas and in Louisiana and then Florida and New Jersey earlier, and but then also we've had mudslides in Sierra Leone. We have things that just happen around the world. So it's just trying to work with that group of leaders, and most bishops think in terms of their own area and where they're assigned, and so it's very contextual, but we are brought together a couple of times a year to try to think about the good of the whole church.
Well, I know your job is super busy, but I wanted to ask, when you get a chance to do something just for you, when you get a chance to do something just to relax, what are some of your favorite things to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, as I said, I love sports. I love watching baseball. I'm a Duke basketball fan, and so those are great. And I'll find myself watching some college football in the fall. I seem like I've gotten away from pro football. Some of that's just some of the issues around concussions and other things. And then often I'm just busy on Sundays. I think I love music, and when I've had time, I love going to concerts. And I love kind of roots music, Americana kind of music. And so that's fun. And we have a small cabin place in the mountains of western North Carolina. And that's has always been a very restful place for us. We've always lived in parsonages. So that's been something we began to do. My wife has a background in interior design, and she also works with the hurricane disaster recovery in Florida. So when we can, we're there. And then we have a 1-year-old granddaughter. So we have 2 daughters, son-in-law, and then this 1-year-old granddaughter. So really, we increasingly find that if we have some days we can place into the calendar, we want to be with them.
Yeah.
And so that's just a lot of fun. And I do find an image I've had for myself is not the image of balance. I don't think I probably live a balanced life, and few people do who were kind of in this role. But I do. I have been able to sort of place in the calendar things that are fun. So in Florida, Disney is here, and there a number of times, and Harry Potter World. Our daughters love that. And then, but then like the Florida Keys are here, and they're just some beautiful places on the coast, and just trying to appreciate kind of what's here all in the midst of it. And so I guess those are things I also love to read.
Awesome.
And I try to I of course read a lot for the church, but I try to also read some things that are not related to the church. Just
for the fun.
Yeah.
One last question. We like to ask our guests for kind of recommendations for a practice that they use to help keep their own spirit in shape. The ways that you kind of keep close to God. What's something you do that you would recommend other people try?
Well, thanks, and thanks, Joe, for the conversation. Well, a few years ago, I began to use the Moravian Daily Text, which is a small book, and it just has a verse every day from the Old Testament, a verse from the New Testament, a couple of fragments from hymns, and a prayer. And then it has some suggested scripture reading. And so that I would say I begin there. It's a small book. You order it every year. And, of course, Moravians have a historic connection with Methodist. And then currently our cabinet this year is reading every month Isaiah 40 through 66 and Romans 8 and Philippians 1 through 4. So that those verses, those chapters, one chapter a day, all adds up to a month, and the next, and we repeat the cycle every month, and we're doing that, starting to do that actually. The Florida and the Louisiana conferences, Bishop Fierro Harvey is doing it as well, and so these were sort of chapters in the Bible that our cabinet and strategic leadership team came to about kind of resilience, about sort of staying focused and spiritually anchored and grounded in the midst of complicated times with the denominational processes, with American society is very polarized, and so currently I'm reading through Isaiah, kind of I think right now Isaiah 59 and 60, and it's just very encouraging. So those are important things, and I try to write each month in about four days that are kind of Sabbath days, and try to really not. They don't always fall on a Saturday or Sunday. There might be a 10-day stretch where there's just things going on, but they talk about in an airplane putting on your own oxygen mask first, and I think people have to stay spiritually grounded. Otherwise they become depleted, and otherwise it just becomes about ego, or we begin to resent people, or we begin to not see people in terms of the image of God in them. So that's something that I've always tried. And then just, I'd say, conversations with a few close friends. And those kind of relationships. So anyway, that's sort of how I try. But I would say it's a work in progress. So probably like everyone listening to this, it's something you sort of try to do day by day. Yeah.
I just love that image of the oxygen mask and taking care of yourself. I mean, that's such a great, for those of us that sometimes feel guilty or feel like it's selfish to take the time.
Absolutely.
What a great and helpful image. Bishop Carter, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you as well. And blessings to you.
I'm thrilled that I got to share with you this conversation with Bishop Kenneth Carter of the Florida Annual Conference, who is serving as the president of our Council of Bishops. If you'd like to hear more of these conversations, go to umc.org/podcasts and look for a section called Bishop's Personal Faith Stories. On the page for this episode, I've put some links to learn more about Bishop Carter and the Council of Bishops, and I've also included a link to the Moravian daily text that he mentioned was part of his daily spiritual practice. And if you enjoy Get Your Spirit in Shape, consider going over to iTunes and writing us a review, because good reviews help people find us. Or you could just tell someone how much you like what you're hearing. In fact, you can suggest that they simply ask Siri, "Subscribe me to Get Your Spirit in Shape." It's really that easy. Hey, thanks for listening. I'll be back soon with another conversation to help keep our souls as healthy as our bodies. I'm Joey Avino. Peace.